Morning, Mr. Smith.
Good morning, Mr. Robinson.
What do we have for our topic today?
Well, it is all over the news, and surely some of our teens and young adults have been seeing it. It's worth talking about. We haven't broached the topic, I think, on the podcast yet. Let's talk about Roe v. Wade and abortion. Thank you again, Jake and Julia, and welcome to the podcast. You may have noticed in the news, if you've been paying attention, it's been hard to avoid if you actually listen to the news in any way at all, that not only was there a major case, several really, but one particular major case concerning the status of abortion in the United States, heard by the Supreme Court many weeks ago, with a decision pending at the end of June, beginning of July, somewhere in there, but a draft decision, which apparently is real, was leaked to the public, saying that apparently they were going to be overturning the 1973 Roe v. Wade decision, which would suddenly open up the entire United States to decide about the status of abortion and how it's regulated on a state-by-state basis. There's so many issues being touched on by this. In fact, Mr. Robinson and I have kind of a potpourri of things that I kind of feel odd as a man that I say the word potpourri every once in a while. But we have a potpourri of things we'd like to talk with you about it. But we thought the best way to start, given how old this was, and given many of you were essentially negative 20 years old or so, or negative 30? Negative 30 perhaps. We're talking about 1973.
Well, I've just looked this up. This was interesting. When it was being argued, I was born. It was being argued in 1971 and decided in 1973.
Right, and I was 3 years old when it was decided. 3 years old. So we thought the best good way to start would be to actually read about the case. It won't take very long, and Mr. Robinson has done the incredibly hard work as our researcher to find a summary of this case. Right, Mr. Robinson?
It entailed one search, one click, and a copy and paste. Okay, Roe v. Wade. I think it would be really good to define what this was because, even if you've heard of it casually, it's good sometimes to get specifically what it was. So Roe v. Wade was a court case. It was a landmark decision of the U.S. Supreme Court in which the court ruled that the Constitution of the United States protects a pregnant woman's liberty to choose to have an abortion without excessive government restriction. I think, as you noted, Mr. Smith, previous to that, it was kind of state by state on what the regulations were. In fact, the woman's name was actually Norma McCorvey, and I don't know why I'm sure there's a good reason why she went by the legal pseudonym. She probably didn't want the criticism on her.
Well, it's interesting. It wasn't so much her. If you look in the history of the case, that's part of it. But she was really she was set up for this, actually. If you go into the history of the case, which all of our listeners can do, if they go to the Tomorrow's World website, you look at the article that Mr. Weston wrote for the May-June 2018 issue called Abortion, the Real Story. It's a two-parter. It's that one cover we have where the baby is being held by some hands and it's in the shape of what it would be in the womb. It's a beautiful cover. And it's the May-June 2018 issue. And then the second part is in the next issue, July-August 2018, Abortion, the Real Story. And he explains how she was sort of hand-selected. And she actually came to disagree with all of this stuff and to be on the other side of things. But yeah, it was one of those cases where they really just want to establish this court case. So they kind of find someone who looks like a good plaintiff. And it sort of goes forward from there. So
for example, she lived in Texas. And at the time, in Texas, abortion was illegal except when necessary to save the mother's life. So I guess, what do you define as strict? I mean, that's a pretty strict abortion policy, as in you can't do it. And the idea of saving the mother, actually, that's a whole other topic we could get into if we wanted to. But anyway, so she lived there in 1969 and had her third child, and I guess her case was taken advantage of by people who wanted to promote this cause of having and I find the word liberty curious that it's used here in the description, the liberty to choose whether or not to keep your child. I would define it a different way. But
in fact, I can't, it's part of my professional problem. I can't help but highlight magazine items because we have a new article coming out, and not in the May, June, but the July, August Living Church News by Mr. Mark Sandor. What a rock star. Mr. Mark Sandor, about liberty and misunderstanding that word. What does it actually mean to a Christian versus the way it's often used in the world? There are a lot of different things set in the Roe v. Wade decision. For instance, there is the idea that when is viability, the whole idea of viability. Viability was supposed to be this idea of how old a child in the womb has to be before it can live outside the womb. At the time of Roe v. Wade, that was thought to be 28 weeks. So they try to create some kind of hard line there at 28 weeks. There was a later case, which is being brought up these days in the context of Roe v. Wade, which was Planned Parenthood versus Casey, happened in the 90s.
Right, 92.
Yes, and that reset the idea of viability because of advance in technology to being 23 weeks, 22 weeks, maybe 24, somewhere around there.
Fetal viability.
Fetal viability, they called it, right? All these arcane, these little technical terms. However, really the effect of Roe v. Wade was to protect abortion as if it is a constitutional right, which really most people have kind of agreed since then. It's literally not in the Constitution. It's not actually present. This was an opportunity for the court to sort of invent a new right by kind of planting ideas and saying that somehow these things are reflected by principles in the Constitution of the United States, for those who are listening not in the United States, that really just leaves it open as something that in which the state is not allowed in any kind of way to put too much hindrance between someone and getting an abortion. To the point that you really have some states, like in New York, where their legislatures were passing laws and regulations saying that you could abort a child at any moment, all the way up to birth, like the very moment a child is going to be born, and the woman saying, you know what, I'm not really ready for this. I wasn't thinking, getting like cold feet at the altar, before a wedding, and just say, I just don't know, and that does. People say that never happens. I'm sorry, there are cases where people have extremely late-term abortions just due to what they consider to be mental distress, and this has left in place a legal architecture in which absolutely these children that are essentially newborns, except for the distance of a few centimeters into the world, that are able to be killed in the womb.
Well, isn't that what is? As this controversy has stirred up and really raged, I'm kind of a little, maybe I'm naive, I'm intrigued by how much this has really grabbed everybody's attention and has quickly been polarizing. But isn't that part of the discussion out there is, those of us as Christians would applaud the idea of Roe v. Wade being overturned and not having this quote-unquote constitutional right to abort your baby if you want to. But what a great point. Conservative states, perhaps like Texas, might revert to a law that they had in place and put heavy restrictions on abortion, but other states could actually expand it and make it much easier to do, as you said, all the way up into a late-term abortion, all the way up to didn't you say Senator Schumer is already talking about a federal bill that would allow you to have abortion in any state all the way up to 9 months.
Right. My understanding is that's what's being discussed right now is understanding that it's entirely possible that Roe v. Wade will be gone. There will be no more way you can argue there's a constitutional right to an abortion. And so they're looking at making a federal law that would prevent any states from being able to pass legislation that in effect would allow a child at any stage. It could be on the verge of being born, and the mother would have the opportunity to be able to decide that child should die instead of actually giving birth to the child. So that's something, given the tightness in the in the Senate right now, it's hard to imagine anything like that will pass. But right now in politics, I don't think they really care what's going to pass or not. They're caring what makes their voters, both pro-life and pro-choice, what makes their voters happy, which really does illustrate one of the perils that we did want to talk about on this, which is that, we are really approaching the end times, and in the end times a lot of things are going to start falling apart. Institutions are going to start to degrade. It's a world that is corrupt in a variety of ways, and all of us have things we're passionate about, and we're going to see our politicians and our leaders talking about the things we're passionate about. But we have to understand that world is not for us. Christ did not command us to get involved in the politics of this world, to try to fix these things through man's methods and man's means, and trying to barter back and forth. And Jesus Christ didn't call us, the Father did not call us, he didn't establish the church to argue about what is constitutional or not. Whether abortion is or is not any kind of constitutional right, quote unquote, doesn't change what's right and wrong. And that's what God has called us to focus on: what is right and what is wrong, and not what is legal or illegal, or what is constitutional or not constitutional.
I think that's such a critical distinction to make. You know, having grown up in the church, I remember when I was somewhere in my mid-teens, I started actually, at that time CNN had come out, and it was round-the-clock news for the first time, round-the-clock news channel, right? And
that's probably unusual for a lot of our teens listening and young adults, but we didn't live in a world where you had news every day.
The local news
all
was
the time.
At 5 p.m. and the national news was at 5:30, and that's where you had the anchors. You had Cronkite and Dan Rather and Peter Jennings and those guys, and they were the anchors, and they were the 5:30 to 6. They told you what the U.S. and the world news was, and like that was it. Well, the paper and the
newspaper.
That was kind of a big deal. But for in the late 80s, for there to start being a cable news channel that was just 24-hour news, all of a sudden the news cycle accelerated. And anyway, I started paying attention to politics more, and I would watch like Crossfire and watch these guys argue with each other. It was kind of interesting. My point is, it's pretty easy to start getting sucked into causes, especially because you feel like a moral. You're compelled morally. Well, shouldn't I make a stand for this? You know,
right.
Let's say there was. In fact, I actually had a guy I used to work with that tried to talk me into coming down with him down to the court. I don't remember exactly what it was, but where they were arguing legislation, and you would kind of make a stand for supporting this legislation. And it was, you know, from a Christian perspective, it was legislation you could get behind in the sense that it was a positive outcome. And I wouldn't go down there with him, and it upset him in time. But you can understand, the point is, why people would want to get pulled towards causes, especially if it feels like there's a strong moral ethic behind it, and like that, well, we should support that. What's wrong with me going down and being part of a protest at Planned Parenthood and being with the pro-life crowd? That's an understandable question. But that's why I think it's so important to understand that the reason that we're called now is to do the work. And sure, we could go down and do something like that, but what effect does it really have? Does it really change anything? You know, humanity is going to do what it's going to do. The only thing we really can do, and are commissioned to do, is be behind the work of God and get the good news out to people, because that's the only thing that actually changes people's lives on a permanent basis. Everything else, in some sense, is just kind of a temporary improvement or a temporary relieving of suffering, whereas God's truth and His plan and His way of living will transform a life, and perhaps the lives of those who then are, you know, funny, the abortion idea, right? If somebody's life is transformed, they go and have kids and teach them that same way, and you can start to an expanding of God's way. But getting involved in these causes, I think, really just pulls us off what our main cause, if I may call it that, is that we're behind, which is getting the good news of Jesus Christ's return and the soon coming kingdom of God.
Right. It really is. You know, you talk about a temporary relief, and I think we can be grateful for temporary reliefs. Like if Roe v. Wade indeed does go away, which it looks like it probably is. It's part of why this may have been released, was to put pressure on the court. But if it does go away, then someone estimated recently, they thought that like 3/4 of women would suddenly not be able to get an abortion in time, because there are some states out there that have laws in place that essentially say, if Roe v. Wade is ever struck down as a precedent, then our state will ban abortions except for these certain instances, right? Like to save the life of a mother or something. And they've got these standing laws that are triggered by a Supreme Court action. So almost instantly, that'll happen in a lot of states. But it's so funny in that when the decision was made in 1973, even Ruth Bader Ginsburg, generally a liberal jurist to be sure, who died not too long ago. Even she said that she felt it was a mistake for the court in 1973 to decide on this case because it's something that she felt should be decided by the people, which is interesting. That's something we just generally don't. We're not pro-democracy in the sense that it's great when a bunch of people get together and just argue about how they should rule. But regardless, she recognized the idea of imposing the decision on the people is part of what's caused it to be unsettled. However, she said she would still support it if it came up. Well, she's passed, and that's part of why this decision is possibly being made right now. However, the point being, she felt it should belong in the political realm. Well, if Roe v. Wade does fall, it is going back to the political realm. Like you said, you've got New York, California, people expect to allow abortion just all the way up again to all 9 months, versus states like Texas that are pretty primed to make it, to ban it. And then other states that'll ban it in various forms. Maybe they'll just add a certain limit in terms of development. But we're actually on the verge potentially of it becoming far more passionate and more political, because now you've got politicians that will be expected to deliver. Either you get abortion back on the books, or you need to ban it even further than it is. And if we haven't seen it play a role in politics before this, we are likely to see it play a much larger role in politics, especially if some, like Miss Ocasio-Cortez in the U.S. Congress, wanting to press for getting rid of the filibuster, which now you don't even need a 60-vote kind of super majority to at least agree with the principles. It's just 50, and now you've got this tossing back. It's actually, if we look at things, it's part of how democracy tends to go in this kind of bickering fashion. But I bring that up for our listeners, those who are young, and some of the not so young. We've got parents who listen, we've discovered and such, that you're looking at an environment where the passions are going to increase, where you're going to have that candidate who says, it breaks my heart to see these women who are harmed, which we could get into. Abortion does harm the women themselves as well.
I shouldn't say never. Very rarely talked about in this
exactly. If anything, evidence gets suppressed about that. But it definitely does harm women as well. And you'll have a candidate who's passionate. I just wish I were in place. Please vote for me. And that's going to pluck at our heartstrings, because we've known, say, people who were harmed by this, and this is a cause, and surely God doesn't want abortion in the country. Surely he would be okay with me supporting this candidate, and missing the larger picture that God doesn't want us participating in the politics of this world. He wants us witnessing to the truth like the prophets of old, but the prophets didn't get involved in that sense in the politics. When God said, make Saul a king, Samuel just did it. He did what God told him to do. When God said, I'm deposing him, go, inform of that, he would do that as well. But you don't get involved in the politics, because the politics are inherently corrupt. There is always a corruption there. That's not why, because it's not the way God chose to do things. A family doesn't operate by the kids getting together and voting on what mom and dad should do. You don't say, Dad made I saw this at Calvin Hobbes strips a long time ago. It's like, Dad, you've made a series of bad decisions recently, and the polls are looking pretty bad for you. That's not how God runs a family. It's not how God runs the world. And we have to be able to step back, and like you did with your friend, that's really interesting, and I can see your friend being offended. Be able to step back and say, look, I am sorry, but I do not participate in these things. I do pray the country changes, and I pray it changes for fundamental reasons, not just because we're trying to do, like there's secularists I know that are anti-abortion. They don't believe in God at all. They just believe that you have a human right to life, and that includes the child in the womb. But where they fail is that if God doesn't exist, there is no human right to anything. We're just animals. There's literally no difference between us and animals. And you can't build any kind of civilization, whether it's pro-life or pro-choice, without recognizing God at the heart of it. And that is the witness that God has blessed us to be able to provide to the world, which is that larger picture that people are not, that does not enter into politics. Frankly, it's not allowed.
And part of your point there, Mr. Ames often will point out the Bible admonishes us to pray for our leaders. I mean, we do hope that we can live peaceable lives, and we're closer to the Christian ideal than not. One of the things that's really struck me about this whole thing is, I mean, I remember what a hot button issue this still was in the 80s, but then it kind of seemed to everybody, I'm oversimplifying, kind of settled in that this was just how it was, and the Christians were still against it, and the more liberal were always supported it, and boy, don't take my rights away. But it went down below a simmer for a long time, and it wasn't an issue. And I'm intrigued by, with this, it's not even been officially overturned, but just leaked that it's going to be overturned. A group of people that went from like zero to boiling mad overnight is astonishing to me. And forgive the characterization. I could see some people taking exception to this, but like super mad that their right to kill their unborn babies has been taken away, potentially taken away from women. I mean, I that's how I would characterize it, and just. I think it's a mix of things. Just a pure anger and hatred that their rights are being trampled on. That's a big theme right now. And what is that right that's theoretically being taken away from them? The right to choose, the liberty to choose whether or not they can kill their unborn child.
Right.
Looking at some of the headlines. Here's one. Abortion group plans drastic action against Christian denomination on Mother's Day.
Wow.
Hey, who can we lash out and hurt and blame for us losing our right to do what we want? Which right. That's a whole other topic. You mentioned one of the a politician wants to push to eliminate the filibuster so that they can override this. I mean,
they're changing the entire way that they're governing just for the sake of overriding this.
Exactly. God says don't move the ancient landmarks, and we're ready to throw out, almost kind of any sort of governmental precedent that we've had. I mean, say what you want about democracy, for a long time there was at least some give and take and some discussion, and we both sides tended to agree that there were certain things in place that we don't violate. And now let's sweep all those aside. Let's override the filibuster. Let's pack the court. What do we have to do to overturn this so that we can maintain our rights?
And it is interesting in terms of what is the source of such passion. And it's not... I agree with the observers I've read that it's not really just about abortion or even the baby. I'll give credit where it's due. There's a Lutheran fellow I follow on Twitter. Essentially got my attention because he makes funny videos. So I'll be upfront. I'm not that deep a person. And he put it really well. I actually should have brought up his quote, and I did not. But I give him credit for the observation. He was talking about the bill that they're currently working on in the U.S. Congress to try to make sure that if Roe v. Wade disappears, we want to make sure we can still kill a child up to 9 months. And he made the observation. He said, in the end, this really isn't fundamentally about abortion. He says their goal is to destroy motherhood. And you might think, well, that sounds insane. You want to destroy motherhood? Who wants to get rid of motherhood? We all love our mothers, but no, I think he is completely right. And Dr. Meredith, frankly, was on this vibe years ago when he talked about Satan's attack on the family. Satan's attack on the family. The devil hates the family structure. He hates a father and husband who actually leads and guides his family, a wife who supports her husband and seeks to fulfill that role as his counselor and as his support, as a mother to her children. The idea that parents really are the reigning ones in the family, and the children should learn from them and be submissive to them as they're growing. That whole family structure, the devil cannot stand. And honestly, we're surrounded in by a society that does not like that as well. Part of it, and forgive me, I don't always go into Marvel movies, but to me, the flack that Joss Whedon got, and I'm not calling Joss Whedon a good person. Apparently, there's a lot of evidence.
He's pretty lefty, but for him to have been criticized, it actually makes it all the more ironic that he was criticized.
Yeah, he's really, actually, they found other material now because all the Me Too movement and stuff has come up with other things. But where he was originally criticized, which I thought was fascinating, was when the second Avengers movie came out, Avengers Age of Ultron. And he's known as a real feminist. All that is apparently questionable, but in terms of the industry, he did the series Buffy the Vampire Slayer. He always featured really strong women and very super, supposedly pro-woman. But in Avengers Age of Ultron, he dared to have a scene in which, and you might remember the scene, where Natasha, Black Widow, as the more recent movie labeled her, is talking to Bruce Banner, the guy who's the Hulk, and they're talking about how they feel like monsters. You know, he turns into the Hulk and he feels like a monster, and it bothers him. It reeks on his conscience. It hurts his conscience. And she said, "Look, you're not the only monster," and because she's an assassin in the story, and she talks about how part of the graduation ceremony for her and her fellow female assassins when they were young was that they would be sterilized. They would be sterilized so that they're made to be infertile, so that essentially they wouldn't care about, there would be less of a risk of them coming to care about something more than the job. And so she felt like a monster. Well, boy, the feminist movement, some of the leading lights just jumped on him like, how dare you make her feel bad, this fictional character, mind you, for not being able to have children. That shouldn't impact her in any way whatsoever. She should just, are you criticizing women pursuing their careers over having children? And he just incurred the wrath of this entire feminist industry for daring to say that a woman who made the decision to allow herself to be sterilized so she would become a better assassin at killing people, taking life instead of giving life, that was monstrous. Well, to me, I do see that in the broader culture. This idea that, motherhood is nice and all, but honestly, if they really could verbalize their statements, it kind of gets in the way.
Right.
Because only women can be mothers. Let's ignore the fact that no one knows what a woman is anymore. Only women can be mothers. And when you have that child, that's 9 months. You're clearly not the same as a man, right? You may not be able to work as hard, to get those reports in, to climb the corporate ladder. And it's a burden on women, and we want to eliminate it so there's no conceivable way a woman might be trapped by motherhood, as if it's a curse instead of a blessing.
This war on the family, and what a great point you brought out, that I think for you and I, from our perspective, we've seen more of kind of the war on dad in terms of trying to minimize dad's role in the family, but also this attack on motherhood. There's a picture I saw of women protesting, and this one woman holding up a sign, and it says, "Why do we still celebrate having children?"
Oh, that's awful.
And it is awful.
That is awful.
And so my wife was telling me last night of a university professor who had built this amazing greenhouse. It was environmentally sensitive and could generate some of its own power. Just a greenhouse.
Wow.
Okay,
yeah.
Not a greenhouse where you grow things. A house that's a green and viable. And then also that they had been responsible as human beings and had only had one child, and that they teach their kids that they should only have one person. And it goes into this idea that's really becoming more pervasive than we think, which is there's a lot of thought out there in some circles that humanity is a plague upon the earth. And what an amazing job Satan has done, not only attacking and trying to destroy the family, and he knows that is the most effective way to unmoor civilization, is to destroy the family, but also to convince us to do it ourselves. That we are our own selves. We are our some of the mind share out there is that we're the problem, which is to some degree true, actually, right?
but not the way they think it is.
But not the way they think it is, and that we're just a plague. We're like a virus on the planet, and if we would just destroy ourselves, everything else would just be better off. Well, if we destroyed ourselves and we have a planet with nothing on it, and what's the purpose for that?
Right, and that's at a time when you have many countries whose birth rates are plummeting so low, they're increasingly not able to support their own infrastructure. You have an increasing number of elderly people without actual young people able to contribute and continue to support them. You have countries that are trying to figure out ways to up their birth rate. But this idea, it is a quasi-religious idea that mankind is a plague. The earth would be better without us. What does better even mean, right?
Why celebrate having children? That's actually a bad thing.
Yeah, I think it's called the Antinatal Movement. Antinatal. There's actually a movement where some say my parents did not have the right. I've actually heard a man say this in court. my parents didn't have the right to decide on my behalf that I should come to exist. And he essentially sued them. Wow. Yeah, no, it's moronic. But the fact is that whether he represents a large portion, he is at the very least a symptom of a movement that has forgotten just how special humanity is and just how fundamentally a gift of life actually is. Admittedly, life in a difficult world because the devil makes it that way. And yet at the same time, it is human life. It is actually valuable. And that's something that I did want to make. We kind of have a small list of things we want to make sure we left here before we left the podcast. And among the things I want to highlight, why is our stand the way it is concerning abortion? Because certainly people are born into difficult circumstances, right? There are people born into poverty. There are people that are born with various conditions, whether it's blindness or deafness or a Down syndrome can be a real challenge. Yep. There's all the things that, frankly, they are aborting children for these days. Why is our position, the biblical position, that life is to be protected? Without going into great detail, I encourage you to read our articles on this. In fact, I wrote a recent one in the January 2022 issue called 7 Lies. Was it 7 Lies about abortion or 7 Lies of the abortion? I can't even remember the title of my own article, but 7 Lies from the abortion industry, and it goes into some of these particular details. But the Bible indicates the life in the womb as being human life. God claims responsibility for it. Of course, sometimes that life does not survive, but we are not to play God and to decide that we are just simply going to kill that life, or to, that we're sitting in his position. And I think it's in that same issue. I'm not sure, but we do have a Q&A, for instance, that asks the question about a particular verse in the Bible that some were trying to say supports abortion when it's actually quite the opposite. The famous line from the Bible, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, it actually ends in a life for a life. And what God is saying is that you will punish crimes appropriately. If it's meant to be a principle of fairness, you knock a tooth out, well, then you need to punish in a way equivalent to that. You don't execute a man because he knocked someone's tooth out. You keep things proportional. But he climaxes that description with a life for a life. And if you read the passage in Exodus, I think it's Exodus 22, could be 21.
It's Exodus 21:22.
Thank you. That's where I got the 22. Exodus 21:22. When he's talking about that, he's talking about if two men are in an argument and a woman is harmed and she's pregnant and she happens to give birth. Let's actually go ahead and read it. Could you read that?
Yeah,
passage,
I have it right here. If men fight and hurt a woman, that's New King James. Making sure that's New King James. Sorry,
it is good.
If men fight and hurt a woman with child, so that she gives birth prematurely, yet no harm follows, he shall surely be punished accordingly as the woman's husband imposes on him, and he shall pay as the judge has determined.
Right. Then it continues. But if any harm, no, sorry, go.
But if any harm follows, then you shall give life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. And again. The Bible has never literally meant an eye for an eye. It was always the idea of the punishment needs to fit the crime. It needs to be appropriate. Somebody does a minor thing and gets really walloped with an excessive punishment. We don't want that. But then also at the same time, something that was pretty serious and gets a slap on the wrist, we don't want that either. Right.
It's really not saying, okay, you knocked a man's tooth out, so we need to make sure we actually knock your tooth out. It is saying you shall punish appropriately, like you just said. And the context is really plain. It says literally in verse 23, if any harm follows, then you make sure you punish appropriate to the harm. Because it says, if no harm follows, the man shall be punished accordingly as the woman's husband imposes on him. That is, they should discuss that because they weren't planning on having that child yet. That could be a financial burden on the family. Yep. There could be different circumstances, and they need to rectify it.
There's a reason you're in the womb for 9 months for full development. So
that's
the
exactly
baby
right.
comes out earlier. That's not good for the baby.
That's right. But it says if any harm follows, and then it talks about life for life. Now, some have tried to say in verse 22, and I'm glad we did turn to the Bible eventually because part of our theme is thinking biblically. Verse 22, it says, so that she gives birth prematurely. And they try to say, that actually means if she miscarries. It's possible that she could miscarry and that not be the equivalent of harm following. Well, one, that's ridiculous on an ancient sense because any miscarriage would still be harm. And I'm not trying to just be I don't know what the word is. I'm not trying to be just overly practical. But frankly, every child that you had born to you was another worker in the family, was another man in the field, that even your children, and this is not the way they're painted in the Bible, but was essentially an asset to you. Happy is the man whose quiver is full of arrows.
That is a great point. Listen, we way underestimate how important sons, we're not being dismissive of the girls, okay?
Right.
How important son, and why you would want, blessed be your family and you have many sons. I mean, that we didn't have John Deere. There weren't tractors back then. You had draft animals for sure. But man, a strapping young boy, and you would have been an excellent farmer, Mr. Smith.
Thank you.
With your 4 boys. But that's a big deal on whether how well you can take care of because most people were either farming agriculturally or animal husbandry, and that's the way people made their livings primarily.
And really, if you had a daughter, she was eventually going to leave you and go to another family. It was also
the betrayal.
Right? Exactly. However, you also gained daughters, and that's part of the value. We're not summarizing all of humanity in these statements, but part of the value of daughters. I know when my mother went through her heart event, not long before she died, but the one that would lead to her death. There were ways, I won't go into detail, it wouldn't be necessary or appropriate, but there are ways my wife cared for her in ways that my mother would not have wanted me to care for her. And my wife did so lovingly and willingly, and it just moved me as her husband that this woman I've married is taking care of the woman I grew up with as my mother. And yeah, a child is, I go into a little bit of my marriage sermon, but is a wonderful gift. So the idea that, if she happens to have a miscarriage but no harm follows, so what? There's no way that's part of the mentality. But even the Hebrew doesn't support that, because when it talks about giving birth prematurely, trying to say that's a miscarriage, you look at that Hebrew phrase, how it's used everywhere else in the Old Testament, none of it is about miscarriage. And there is a Hebrew word for miscarriage, which is not this. Rather, it's used not only for births, regular births, like Job uses the word, if I recall, for his own birth, but even when Israel went out of Egypt. That wasn't a miscarriage, that was a leaving, that was a departing. It's literally the way the New King James translates it, gives birth prematurely. But the point is, that principle alone highlights that God considers the child in the womb, it calls it a child, that considers that child alive. There's lots of verses you can go to in Psalms where he talks about, David says that he was woven together, essentially, you knew me in the womb, he says. You knew who I was going to be. You knew what I was. God is involved in that life. It is a human life. Even the medical books, people want to say, it's not a human life until it's born. Well, no, that's not true.
No, I mean, it's I think in 8 weeks or less, there's a beating heart.
Right, exactly right.
Let's not kid ourselves. Like, this is a human life forming. There's no two ways about it.
Right. It's we know it's a life. It's not a chicken life. It's not a grizzly bear life. It is not a frog life. What is it? It's a human life. As there's this secular pro-life group I follow on Twitter, and they took a picture of an old standard medical book. It's not a religious book. It's a medical book that says literally that when sperm and egg unite and you form a zygote, that is the beginning of human life. That is the human life has begun at that point.
Is that what we call that?
There's actually different words for the stages, but if you listen to the abortion industry, they will try to use those words to dehumanize the child.
Yeah.
But that's like saying, well, a child isn't a human, or an elderly man is not a human, or a preteen is not a human. That's simply a word for a certain stage of human development. That's why they don't like calling, say, the child in the womb. They want to call it a fetus, like somehow that'll distance you from the child. But no one says, "Oh, mom and dad, I just want to let you know I'm with fetus." No, they say with child. That's the phrase. But yeah, don't get caught up in the world's thinking on these things. Don't get caught up in the worldly contention over these things. We make sure we settle on the truth. That's where we take our stand, is on the biblical truth, and that is human life in the womb.
You were just a little bit earlier. I was thinking, because you mentioned about life, and you look through the history of humanity, life is cheap, but to God, life is very, very precious, and He cares about it deeply. And that's one of His core beings, is that He is life. And so...
Yeah, the ever-living one. That's how we read YHVH when we're giving sermons. He's the ever-living one.
Exactly. So, the idea that we could take this into our own hands and abort a child because it's inconvenient or we've messed up, it does not appear to be God's view at all, that every life is precious, and it's precious while it's developing in the womb, as we read there in Exodus. I thought we could hit one last thing, Mr. Smith, because I feel like in some ways the topic wouldn't be fully covered if we didn't mention this. So if you were on the pro-choice side, what is your stances and why? And I don't think this is an oversimplification, but one of the big one is the idea of our body, our choice. Okay? Mm-hmm. I have the uterus. This is where the baby grows. Let's ignore for now if a trans man who has a uterus has a baby. we're gonna disregard that. Our body, our choice, and it's that view that women get to decide. And so, really, this mindset that's going on with the Roe versus Wade being overturned is now there really is a view with a large number of pro-choice women that feel like, now the government gets to control my body and gets to decide what happens, and that I was talking to my daughter about it, and she mentioned some women even claim now they're going to be more unsafe because if they still want to have an abortion, they have to be riskier in doing it. Okay, so from my perspective, that's just such a ridiculous argument because there's about 20 steps before you got pregnant that you could have taken where you had a choice over your body and whether you were going to have, there's many birth control options out there. There's how about we don't have sex before we're ready to have a baby. There's that idea.
And let me jump in before anyone discredits what you're saying with the thoughts that they've been fed by the abortion industry. They'll say, but what about rape? What about, abuse? What about situations where you were not in control? It's not that those situations don't exist, and we can actually address that at the end as well because it's related to what you're saying. But if you go read my article on 7 lies, abortion, those are a incredibly small fraction. The vast majority of these elective abortions, they're simply being used as a birth control device. That's what they are.
Well, so I didn't actually see it, so maybe I shouldn't comment on it, but there's a woman that goes and does a lecture and talks about all her accomplishments and all the things that she's done, and then she reveals at the end that she was conceived by a rape. And her point was, if I can oversimplify again, hey, I'm glad somebody didn't kill me just because I came across in a suboptimal way. I still got to live life and do amazing things and go on and have her own family and things like that. So, I know that's a tough stance to take on the idea of rape, but as rough as it is, that is not that child's fault that they came into the world that way.
Right. And those cases are, in terms of abortions, rare enough. They shouldn't interfere with what your point was there were plenty of opportunities.
Plenty of opportunities, and not only that, okay? Apparently, if you go into Planned Parenthood to have an abortion, they have a thing you fill out, and you put the purpose for it, why you're having the abortion. And apparently, at least 60% of them are basically because they took no precautions and got pregnant accidentally. I would argue that these women were careless and irresponsible, and now this child is paying the price with its life, literally, and it's 60%. So,
and I wouldn't just put that on the women. The men involved as well. There was generally one has also been irresponsible and not caring for the potential child or the woman.
Well, if we're gonna be fair about it, the women have always borne the burden, and the guys have gotten off easier on this for sure. And that does not let the guys off the hook. That was an irresponsible behavior. Yes, thank you for mentioning that.
Yeah, there was actually a good. Sometimes the pro-choice sides will say, hey, how about if we allow, if you decide to get rid of abortion, then we start requiring the men who impregnate these women to have to support that child 100%. It's like,
sounds like a great idea.
Yeah, I don't think that's the own that you think it is. That sounds like a fantastic idea, right?
So, I guess my point is, if we've gotten to the point where we're making an appointment with Planned Parenthood, that ignores all the other opportunities you had to not be in this situation.
Right.
There's a lot of ways you could do it without, people are critical of saying abstinence, but A, that does work, but B, even outside of abstinence, there are a number of other ways that you could control your body and not become pregnant. I'm not even advocating for that. I'm just saying
Right.
that's the reality. Looked up the statistics. Since 1973 in the United States, there have been over 63 million aborted babies. Mm-hmm. That is I would argue that is a true apocalypse. That's not the word I'm looking for. What's the
Holocaust?
Word? Holocaust, yes.
Holocaust.
And I've heard people refer to it before as like the silent Holocaust.
We have an article. It's an old article in the Tomorrow's World magazine, but I think it's called abortion. It might be the silent Holocaust or abortion. But it's definitely, we use the word Holocaust in the title.
So the question I would ask is, how does God feel about it?
That's exactly right. And there's Mr. McNair brings this out, I think, in his, we've referred to his sermon when Mr. Sandor was here. We focus so much on rights in the country. And why? Because, we live in a world in which men rule, and most men have been all about what they want when they're in power. And so they do things to oppress you. They do things to use you. And so we've talked about people having rights. But it really is interesting. The Bible focuses on duty, which includes rulers. It's not so much that it's not a question whether the people have rights. The ruler has a duty to respect people and to treat them as God's children. Well, that's really part of what we face here, and it is difficult in some ways, but it's actually a part of real life. You talked about this idea that my body, my right. My body, my choice. That's a one, like what it said in episode 3 of Star Wars. Only the Sith deal in absolutes. Well, that's not true. There are absolutes in the world, but that is a man-made absolute. That's not a God absolute. And really, it runs up against the fact that not only is the female body astonishingly different from the male body in that it is the only one capable of nurturing a child to life. The moment that a man and woman in a family, when they make a baby, that is a unique environment. That is a completely different circumstance. You can't just say, well, all the same rules apply, because they don't. This is how humanity is made. This is how we grow as a species. We make more of ourselves. It's how God designed things to change. And to just say, well, it doesn't make a difference. I said, no, you actually have an obligation now. The man also has an obligation. And I do agree, we're in a broken world where the men don't always do their part as well. But that said, we have this focus on right, and we don't have a focus on duty. And yet, if you were, let's say, Mr. Robinson, you went into the doctor tomorrow and were told you have a neurodegenerative disease, that over the course of the next 10 years, you're not necessarily going to die, but there's nothing science can do, and you're going to continue to deteriorate. Well, you know what? That wasn't a choice you made. Your body, your choice. You didn't say, hey, yeah, you bet. I want to have a neurodegenerative disease. But that's the way life works. And I don't want to mention Jordan Peterson in every podcast that we do. But in this fallen world, there are things we don't choose to have. But it doesn't change the fact that, okay, I didn't ask for this assignment, but this is the assignment I've been given. How am I going to deal with this? Right. How am I going to continue to serve my family how I can? How am I going to grow in humility so that when the point comes where I need to be served instead of serve, I'll do so graciously, like Christ expected the apostles to do when he was washing their feet. That's my duty. If this is the time I've been given on earth, then I have a duty to live it a certain way and to play the hand I've been given in a manner that God and Jesus Christ would be pleased with how I've played that hand. Well, I would say whether someone becomes pregnant because of sin, fornication when they shouldn't have been, whether they become pregnant because of a terrible act of rape, whatever the case may be. The fact is, we don't get to choose our circumstances, but the question still remains, what is our duty under those circumstances? If God because God does allow terrible things in this world. This is not the kingdom yet. This is not our eternity. This is a world that is fallen, in which we experience terrible tragedy. But like James, I think I mentioned it when Mr. Sander was here, James Quincy Adams said once, Duty is man's. Results are God's. Once we're in a circumstance, what is my duty before God? What is it He would want me to do? And just like that woman who, after talking about all these things she was blessed to be able to achieve, happens to mention that she was the product of a rape. She mentioned that she's still so grateful, that her parent was willing to do that.
Right.
I would love it if we lived in a world that rather than says, well, in order for you to maintain the life you want to be able to live, you should be able to kill at whim. Not talking about therapeutic cases where there's truly, these really tragic biological cases where the mother is going to die and circumstances like that. But rather these cases where, let's look at the vast majority of cases, which are normal, healthy children in an environment where someone just doesn't want the child.
Yeah, they're aborted because it's inconvenient.
Exactly. We're not allowed to say, God, this is just inconvenient for me. There's times we have to say, okay, this is the hand that we've been dealt. Then we're going to accept that, and we're going to do what God would have us do with this. It's not about our right to do this or that. God has given us free will. We, in that sense, quote unquote, we have the right to sin, quote unquote, because God has given us free will. He doesn't force a choice on us, but He does long for us to do what we actually should.
Right.
And that applies in these cases as well. I'm not saying they're easy decisions. It's not a matter of choosing what's easy. It's a matter of choosing what's right.
Exactly. And having raised 2 children, your list of top 5 things. I mean, I only say that to give myself some space. Honestly, one of the single most rewarding things I've ever done in my life, besides, making a commitment to God and marrying my wife, was raising children. It's so rewarding and edifying on every level. It's a shame that we've misused sex in the way we have, because being in a truly committed, long-term relationship with a commitment to the other person for life is the best possible environment in which you can have children, and it's one of the most rewarding things you can ever possibly do in your life.
And I think that brings it back to the point we talked about, that really ultimately this is not just an attack on children or attack on babies or whatever. It really is the devil's attack on the family. Yep. He does not like that environment. It's a picture of the God family itself. He does not like that, and he would love to tear that apart. And as you just said, there are so many blessings for those willing to embrace the duty that it represents.
I mean, the Bible clearly, over and over, views baby and portrays having children as one of the greatest blessings you can have from God.
Children are a heritage of the Lord. Well, I think we've covered it.
I think so. Good topic, Mr. Smith.
All right. Thank you all for listening to us for so long. And whatever part of the day you're in the middle of, we hope the rest of this day goes well for you.
Smith and Robinson.